So hello and welcome, Jack. Jack, welcome to the podcast. And yeah, thanks first of all for accepting this invitation on such a short notice. And yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on board.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me, Furkan. We're old friends, so it's nice to be here chatting. And yeah, I think it's a great project. So I feel really privileged and excited.
Likewise, Jack. I mean, yeah, we've met. We've luckily, like, not all the guests I have on the podcast I've had the fortune to meet. But yeah, your profile, it's not something random. I knew about you. We've met thanks to Mad Academy, which we'll hear more about through the podcast. But Jack Muirhead, is that right? How I pronounce your last name?
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, it's a strange. I'm an Australian guy living in Denmark with a Scottish last name.
Oh, lovely. Well, we'll get more into those details of how that journey brought you to Copenhagen and where it started first. But Jack, for somebody who you like, I don't know, for a family member who you want to introduce yourself to, what is it that you do? How do you define the kind of jobs you've done?
Yeah, that's a good question. Recently I've been going through a bit of a career break and I've really had to reflect on that. But I think I would still call myself like a bartender or a hospitality professional. That was my sort of upbringing. I spent about 15 years working in hospitality, mostly in Australia, but also a little bit of time in the US and Japan and now in Europe. And that was what I did until about 7 years ago, was sort of high-end bartending and working in front of house. And then more recently, since moving to Denmark, I've been doing, I guess, what you would call like education building, or looking at sort of how we can tackle some of these challenges in hospitality via training, small programs, and sort of resources building for hospitality professionals of all levels.
And now that you mentioned, I mean, Australia, hospitality, what was your first entry point? Was it something in your family, or how did this profession come up? Like, why did you end up behind bars?
Yeah, I didn't know. It's a great question. I think like most people that sort of fumble into this industry, it tends to be like an early job, a want for some pocket money. And then, you find this like energy, or you find this hook in serving people, or the kind of the buzz that you get from being in that flow state as a craft person. My early work was really, like being a sort of checkout guy or working at a counter in small local bakeries. I think I just really like the people, and that hasn't really changed. I think had I gone into any other industry, um, and I found the same energy there, whether that was like something to do with culture, like music or the arts or fashion or something, I probably would have stayed with that as well. I think hospitality is just one of the best vehicles we have to engaging with other humans, and like, frankly, giving them a great time and a great experience, which is a pretty rewarding thing.
Yeah, and how that I love how you mentioned that your entry point was actually a bakery, which is, I think, yeah, one of the parts of the food system which people keep forgetting, that it's not just hospitality, it's not just restaurants, but the industry has so many more aspects of it where food is where you come in contact with the people. And I think bakery is somewhere where it's you're meeting people who are there on a daily basis as a routine part of aspect to it, and then from there going into bars. So how much of I mean, for me, it's interesting that you switched from there into the job you later did, which is where we came into contact. But how much of those years would you say, like, somehow the fruit of your work right now was, I don't know, understanding people or coming in contact with the human side of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess is the question, how did I transfer through those things, or what did I sort of see in that early work that was useful later?
Yeah, more like, yeah, what kind of learning did you get from there? Because people would think, how can you get into education being somebody who's working in a bar? So what learnings did you get from that which helped you get into education, for example?
Yeah, I suppose like the simplest way of putting it is like I always had a really great time in hospitality, and I say that reflecting on being a white guy from a pretty privileged background, and I worked for like a lot of mom and pop businesses that were, maybe not always the most successful or most sound in terms of like quality or communications or anything. But I really always just had a really lovely time, and I'd be lying if I said didn't witness anything negative.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, my experience was really positive. And I think the longer that I went into my career and the more I traveled and things, I started to realize that maybe my experience wasn't normal. And I really didn't like that. I thought, I had a great time in this industry. I saw it really reward a lot of people in very different ways. And I think we sort of see the reward this industry provides a little bit differently now, as well as the limitations and the challenges. But I really wanted to find a way to talk more about that. I was always the one after work, chatting with friends about other places or how things could be maybe different, if not better. And the way that people did things and worked in different venues all around the world really fascinated me. So I think my work towards education was really foundational to have a broad range of experiences and a frame of reference. You know, you mentioned the different types of industries. I've worked in pretty serious coffee shops. I worked in bakeries. I worked in front of house service. I worked in like, you know, world's 50 best cocktail bars and some, you know, Michelin starred restaurants. So there was a huge range of exposure there. But yeah, that commonality of like, why don't more people have a better experience in hospitality? And how could I find a job that let me work on that?
And now that you mentioned, like this kind of a standard, or like, I mean, our understanding of maybe talking to colleagues or peers, because hospitality happens to be an industry where people more than like, I mean, I right now coming from India, sitting now in Germany, working in Spain, for you growing up in Australia and now sitting in Copenhagen, it does create this influx of people. And that also means that people carry their culture. So do you think there is a common thread? Because when you approach education, there has to be some sort of standardized methods and practices. But then how do you also at the same time value the differences in the way hospitality would have been in Japan, for example? I would like to hear how was it, say,
Hmm.
being in Japan? Because I've always heard how work culture is so different out there compared to, say, Australia, which in my head, I think of it as laid back, what I would think, but then again, I haven't had first-hand experience. So would you say all these hospitality scenarios are connecting, but still very different in their own small bubbles?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose the elements of hospitality that are sort of universal, like you have this business, people work within it, and then you have a clientele. And I think culturally and geographically, all of those things differ. But primarily, it's sort of the type of business that is viable in different places and how guests interact with food and what a sort of dining experience is very different in different parts of the world, in my experience. But I think if you look at the other component there, which is the people that work within the industry, I think like they're kind of universal type of person. You know, not to say that there isn't a huge diversity and a lot of different people in hospitality. I think the industry is doing better at recognizing that and sort of encouraging that now. And I'm not just talking along sort of like gender lines or background, but just like types of personal want there. I think we're really looking at that differently now. But yeah, I mean, for example, in Japan, right, like there is a very big sort of city country divide there, and how you access food and the types of homes that people have dictates that, they eat out more. So there's more convenient food, and thus food needs to be sort of more quicker in service style. It needs to be more convenient. It needs to be filling. It needs to be lower cost, more valuable, and situated at these places where commuting and things can happen. So that then informs the type of business that you can actually run viably if you want to feed a range of people. And I think sort of, because you mentioned India, like some of these other cultures than the West, which is where a lot of the sort of modern food media focus is, or a lot of people might find inspiration, even if they come from these backgrounds. I think there's so much interesting things to learn from those. For example, I mean, just thinking about how a city like Mumbai or Delhi like runs in that sense, like how do you feed so many people, the distribution of food, the access to, yeah, basic, whether it's a rice pit dish, roti, the way that religion interacts in those countries with meat, the changes that we're seeing in that as Western influence. I'm sort of spiraling out of your question here.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge range of different types of business and different guest wants. But ultimately, I think the sort of people that work in hospitality, I would see as a sort of fundamental, sort of shared type of person.
And that's super interesting was how you mentioned like how it's not just what happens in the restaurants and what happens in the dining rooms, but so much more beyond. I mean, I also feel that somehow it does translate to, even if you don't think about these bigger pictures, it does translate into like the kind of fine dining you would say in Mumbai compared to the one in Copenhagen would be so different just because the restaurant being aware in the place it's set
Yeah,
into, right?
I think that's an interesting example. Like, I think fine dining is a bit of a hot topic, or maybe we're past being a hot topic now. But I think at the higher ends of the market, let's say where money comes into the picture, I feel like the business is a little bit more hereditary, or like there's quite a bit of arbitrage. And I think we're seeing more and more of that these days as information is just easier to export and to share. I don't know if arbitrage is a good thing. I think hospitality is pretty arbitrageous in many
Uh-huh.
ways. Like a lot of things are copied there, and maybe like a personal opinion that I think, it's very much I see, I do kind of industry. And I would say, yeah, I'm sure there's differences in fine dining and things, but fine dining in the pointy end, you tend to cater to a type of clientele who have more freedom of movement, they have more resources. So those people are kind of traveling the world and almost seeking the same thing with like slightly different elements no matter where they go, because they're looking for maybe a more detailed, more longer experience. I think that's why we also see this pushback now, because more people want to experience maybe authentic or real or traditional or local. A lot of buzzwords and semantics is really important there. Types of food or food that represents the places they visit. And fine dining can be an amazing vehicle for storytelling. It can be really representative of sort of different ways to present that. But I think people also really enjoy now going to the market or lining up at some mom and pop bakery or finding and digging around for the more real places.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting how this whole paradigm is shifting of like what is luxury? Is it like serving foie gras and caviar, or is it getting me something exclusive, which is not necessarily as expensive? Your profile is very interesting because the name of the podcast being Fugitive Chefs, most people we have on board are chefs, exceptions of some people who've been into food technology or food science, but still a very, I would say, first-hand food side of things. And for me, in that sense, your perspective is important because all the things that you're mentioning right now, I would say for the past, I don't know, the past 30 years, the ones championing these change within restaurants are mostly the star chef, the star face, I would say, is the chef in most cases. Today, it's shifting a little bit more through, I think, what you mentioned, 50 best bars, titles like that, with, yeah, also like front of house taking interest into doing things which make the restaurant stick out of sorts. So, in that sense, how much of the shift are you actually seeing? Do you see a real shift into front of house getting more presence into, say, the philosophy of a restaurant or how a restaurant does
Hmm.
things?
No, actually the opposite. I think went for that example. Like I think front of house is something really I'm really personally involved in and passionate
Mm-hmm.
about, having come from that. And I think, yeah, you mentioned some really interesting sort of, I think, vehicles for maybe promotion or for sort of validating ideas, like these awards ceremonies and accolades, which are, I think, to be respected on one hand, but also to be sort of questioned or looked at for their influence on status and how that forms also a part of the culture of hospitality. And I think, like you said, this 30-year period, we've sort of seen this huge boom in interest in food. Also in sort of the celebritization and the way that the world has become really focused on individuals as brands and how we sort of are really able to present ourselves on platforms. And I think that's been super beneficial to chefs and really amazing for driving public interest in food and restaurants. And, maybe for better or worse, it's also because of these other factors diminished the role of media or journalism, which used to be sort of a bit more king-making, able to
Mm-hmm.
sort of provide that spotlight to people. But I also think we've sort of changed, and a good friend of mine who's a restaurateur, he points out to me all the time that Michelin stars, for example, they used to be given to restaurateurs. They weren't given to chefs up until
True.
I think the 80s or 90s, which is when they were first provided to chefs. So we've seen that change, this sort of handover of people that ran restaurants and chefs in a more secondary role, or at least more as an employee, not the face of the restaurant, to
Mm-hmm.
something where they're really at the front. And I think that has been really fascinating and really positive, but also, brought forth these challenges. I think, we look at craftspeople with this sort of mysticism and this sense of like, wow, how creative and how do they think and what is their process? And
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of a type of thing within the world today. And I don't know if we validate service-based people, and I would probably count coffee and beverage within that, but they're even still celebrated. I think there was a funny chef's table version of bartending or master chef
Mm-hmm.
version of bartending at some point. But those things haven't really stuck with people the way that chefs have. And now, we
Mm-hmm.
have things like The Bear and Boiling Point and all these sort of shows that have also put maybe a different spotlight on chefs. And I think whether that's a good influence on younger people and how we should strive to work in this industry, I don't know. I think that's still a really great debate and something to think about. What is it really to be a chef? And how much do you need to know about the craft, or is it about platforming yourself and being good at marketing and being able to find an audience? And how much does this sort of take us away from the core of what this job is, or maybe what it used to be, which was essentially like making people happy and giving them a great experience with food, or just providing some nourishment for people that couldn't find it or couldn't prepare it themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't. I mean, I pushed you to that question, but it doesn't really have an answer to itself because as you said, it's completely opposite what has happened. That the focus used to be the front of house. It became the chefs, which we all saw as a good thing, and I think it does have its good aspects, as you said. For me, also
Yeah.
having a past in activism and politics, I see a similar things happened in the political scenario of things where people used to have first the parties, and then a person becomes more important than the
Mm.
party, and it's always you never know which way the person would go and if the party would follow. And what happens when the person dies down? Do the values still uphold? So it becomes kind of a few players managing, say, a big story of how hospitality should be seen. And which is why I think education and institutions like MAD, which are not related to restaurants or not directly related to restaurants, do play a big role, because they get to see from the outside the good and bad and be able to navigate through them to give people within the industry some sort of bigger picture. Okay, these things do
Mm.
have an impact, I would say. And moving on from there, was there like a sudden need in you? I mean, you touched upon that topic briefly, but what exactly led you to look outside? I mean, you said you wanted a bigger platform. From what I understood, that you wanted some opportunity where you can connect with more people rather than just a restaurant, 15 people inside a restaurant team. What was the way you pivoted into education, I would say?
Yeah. I mean, it was kind of happy circumstance and sort of again
Uh-huh.
like a fumbling sense of curiosity, I think, that led me to MAD. I mean, I think I was really fortunate to come to Copenhagen, which is where I live now and where MAD is based. It was founded by Rene Redzepi of Restaurant Noma about 12, 13 years ago now. And, I think Copenhagen was an interesting place. It was like one of these hotspots. There was a world spotlight on it. Everybody from media to chefs to the public was really fascinated by what was happening here for like 10 or 12 years, and to some extent still are. But I think it's sort of now we're in a time where there's not that one city in the world where everybody cares about what's happening in food. And before that, maybe it was in Spain or etc. And I mean, to backtrack to the question, like I'd sort of found this place and I just found energy here really amazing. It was a
Uh-huh.
place, I grew up in a small town in Canberra in Australia, which is like such a fantastic city. It's a very nice place, but it's not the most exciting. There are a couple of venues where you know everyone, you go there all the time. And when I came to Copenhagen, I just had my eyes opened to, this different degree of dedication, of creativity, of wanting to show more, to find a way to do new things. And I think that was really, the right thing for me at that age. I was probably around 20, mid 20s, and I'd pushed as far as I felt I could myself personally. So I wanted to find a place where I could take in more, rather than maybe teach other people. And I think coming back here 6 or 7 years ago, I was fortunate to find, an internship at MAD, which is this sort of amorphous, like not-for-profit thing that Renee started as a way to platform and have conversation. It was really like internal looking for the industry in hospitality,
Uh-huh.
and a way to think of like how can we have a vehicle that helps drive positive change, like and to try to define what some of that might be on a hospitality industry level and on a food systems level as well. So I mean, yeah, once I sort of bumbled into that door and found my way into MAD, I think there was a project in the works at the time that was looking at like how do we take all of these topics like working hours, working conditions, sustainability, careers, and how to think about those, and what kind of businesses are viable, and also all these sort of scientific or anthropological elements of food. Like, how can we turn that from a conversation into something that's a little bit more actionable and provides resources? And MAD had come up with this idea at the time to essentially build a unique type of education, or to focus on training people in hands-on ways, giving them basically sort of three things, which were fundamental knowledge, and then practical and really useful tools, and then also this sort of mindset or inspiration change that would help people, go home and reform their businesses or upgrade them or change, or just think a bit differently about their practice.
When Mad as a foundation has been something very exemplary, the way they've done things, and not just Mad. I think a lot of things that have come out of Noma, be it the Nordic Manifesto or the Food Lab itself, the Sky Lab, which was made at ETU. I think what's been good, not just with Noma, is it's been, I think, backed very much by the ecosystem where it's based, the governments, the institutions, the formal associations behind it, and there's a lot of work, I think, of consolidation, of not just milking the cow, but also trying to reap benefits of it, which could multiply on a bigger scale. So based on this, do you think, I mean, you coming from Australia, I don't know how much of this kind of an attitude or this kind of atmosphere you saw in your surroundings back then, but how much of a role would you say that? I mean, I understand MAD was started by a group of people, but how much would you owe all of that to the ecosystem around it, or to the support received by the system where it existed?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you have to look at this sort of set of contexts that all of
Uh-huh.
this was born from. And by all of this, I mean, sort of this boom in Nordic gastronomy at the time, which, was really led by a group of chefs here, Rene, Klaus Meyer, and a couple of the people that then worked for them. And this set of ideas that they brought together. But I also think there was a ton of context there. Copenhagen was a ripe city, and Denmark is a ripe place for that. It was also emerging into sort of a different generation, which had more money, more interest, more want for
Uh-huh.
that. It's also like really proud country, but it doesn't have a huge, and it didn't have a huge dining culture. Like the food history here and agricultural sort of history is really interesting. But as far as restaurants and things go, there was kind of a blank slate in some way. So they were able to do that. I think, people had also, maybe as we're seeing a reaction against some of those sort of more serious fine dining elements now, at the time, we'd gone through this sort of molecular gastronomy thing, which, taught a lot of people about science and all the sort of really sort of hands-on, intricate food. And this was maybe a little bit more of a natural approach, looking back to nature. And, that lined up a lot with our discoveries around the impacts of food on climate and a want to maybe just get back to sort of craft in a different way. So I
Uh-huh.
think, those contexts are really, really important. Also, the fact that, Denmark was really supportive of this and used it a lot as a sort of body to build off of for the tourism industry and for the sector. And I think the city was also really full of people willing to work collaboratively and to build a community here. Now, if we look at that outside of Noma, which still is a big draw card, we have an amazing coffee industry, bars, the beverage side of things here is really good. And I think bakeries, cafes, and also talking to other people in other industries over the last few years, what I've learned is even things like fashion, the museums, all of them also understood that this was happening and tried to sort of get on the back and support that. So I think it's a really powerful example of the value of food in today's culture and the role that sort of chefs or culinary professionals, anyone who works with food and beverage has. That every property developer, every government, like it might not seem like they're that invested in supporting the industry, but I think there is a lot of powerful example in Copenhagen and what has happened in other cities to point to for the value that this provides and why it needs support and deserves it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, for the short time I spent there at Mad Academy, I mean, I saw so many initiatives happening. Just like I remember the one day we went to forage with the Wild Mad team on how they are training forest rangers to not just do the usual forest ranger job, but also learn about the whole plant system around them, the mushrooms, all the whole edible ecosystem in their everyday playground, and to
Hmm.
create resources, to create recipes around it. I think there's so much work which should have been obvious, but somehow has not been obvious. And I think Mad came from a position where they knew that they had that knowledge and they've contributed to it. But Jack, personally, somebody who entered into this, which can, I mean, as your entry point was as an intern, which I think is a great place because it gives you access to a lot of information without, say, being having to be responsible for all of it, but gives you a place to, say, ask a lot of questions. I think I'm going towards this question because a lot of people listening to this podcast are people who, say, have ideas like yours, have tested their ideas, but they don't have the kind of outreach, or that they're not able to see themselves, as a part of something so big. If I'm somebody who's right now in front of house and would love to be a part of Mad or some similar association like this, I don't see myself completely fit, because I think, okay, what I do is serving guests or making cocktails.
Hmm.
How does my knowledge anyway be of any use to this kind of a foundation? So what would you say to people like these? Like, how was your first few months in Mad?
Yeah. Wow. It's a long time ago. It's good to think about. I mean, like, I think if I look at it now, like, I didn't understand what I saw in Mad at the time, but it was probably like something I thought about, like, what's going to suit me, like what drives me. And I think I mentioned earlier, we have a bit too much of a sort of one size fits all, or only a
Mm-hmm.
very few career paths in hospitality. And if you're a young waiter and you want to, start community events, or you want to learn more about sustainability, or you want to start a home recipe platform on your Instagram or something. I think that is actually all a lot more viable now than it was
Mm-hmm.
when I was, starting at Mad. And I think it's really important that you try to figure out like who you are and what suits you as well. At Mad, I got to work a lot with Magnus Nilsson, who was the chef of a restaurant called Fabriken. He's opening a new place in Sweden called Pension Fruheim. And he always had this line that he had met a lot more people in hospitality and was really lucky to, you know, meet and talk to a lot of great business owners. And his sort of hypothesis, I hope I get this right, was basically that a lot more people in hospitality than in other industries end up running businesses that are not suited to them, that they don't
Mm-hmm.
like. So I guess if my advice to younger people is like, try to make decisions around what you personally think and what you want, and try to follow and foster this like curiosity and a sense, and experiment on things to sort of figure out what your path is, not looking at
Mm-hmm.
your idols or the people with the most followers on Instagram, or even what your neighbors do. I think, because I also understand that can be really isolating to spend a lot of time thinking
Mm-hmm.
about yourself, and you can feel like yourself maybe that you don't have the opportunity or the chance there. I mean, what I saw at Mad over the years was, I spent, I guess, 5 days with like 1,000 young hospitality people, which is a great sort of set of data, I suppose, was that like almost everyone in hospitality feels alone, or they don't feel connected to the industry in a sense. And I mean, it's a very big industry. There are, I think in Europe it's like 28 million people work in hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot more people out there than you think. And I think we need to kind of get over the hump of asking for help or telling people what we want to do. And also, really critically, being positive about other people's ideas. I suppose, I've swayed into more like general hospitality thoughts there. But I think believe in yourself, and ask people to believe in you as well, and
Mm-hmm.
make conscious choices. That would be my sort of
Mm-hmm.
thought for younger people.
And I mean, I loved the bit. I loved all of it, but I loved the bit where you said like ask people to believe in you, because I think a lot of times, I mean, I see it myself. Before the current job, when I was applying for this job or looking for what else is out there. Mostly we somehow undervalue ourselves, or mostly we don't see how what we already know could be of value to somebody who's hiring you in the future.
Mm.
Also, what has changed is today, I think the kind of job you did, or the kind of jobs does that Matt still does, which is a lot of say consultancy work or creating programs for institutes. Traditionally, we looked at very different kind of profiles. Say somebody from, I don't know, somebody from an academic end has to come and teach a hospitality person, whereas now people are realizing that maybe it's more relevant to bring somebody like Jack, who has been there, has learned this new set of skills, and might be the perfect person to empathize with the one he's gonna educate of that sort. So I feel also like what you said about getting people to understand the value that you bring on board
Mm.
is something I think me and others who've been in hospitality kind of overlook.
Yeah, I think it would be great if we developed a bit more of a mentorship culture, and were a little bit, there was more, I think to sort of contextualize a lot of what I saw at Mad, and I think how this sort of maybe also relates is like, there isn't very many resources for people in
Mm-hmm.
hospitality. Like, it doesn't feel like there's a lot out there for you that is specifically for you. I think one of the things that drew me to Mad was that like I felt I could learn things there that I couldn't learn by myself. And I was someone who, my friend will tell you, like lugged, like 3 really heavy paperback cocktail books around Europe because I was like
Mm-hmm.
so keen to like learn specs. And I see that with young chefs, they're collecting knowledge in this way, and I think we just need to also be maybe better at giving a bit of that back. But I think there's a a challenge in that not a lot of people feel that they're doing very well, or that what they have to offer is valuable to others. But I hear a lot from really senior people as well, that they are seeking a mentor. They want someone to help advise them. And I don't have the solution for that. But I do think breaking down some of these barriers, at being respectful, at trying to share more information and speak in real terms, is something that we could all do a bit more of in hospitality.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see, like from your experience through Mad Academy specifically, which is the last role you held, how do you see the contribution of this sort of an education, say Mad Academy, and other people also trying to give? Because I remember, for example, I was at that point working in Mugaritz.
Hmm.
I had this opportunity to come for a week to Copenhagen, and for me, was a lot I was looking forward to. But believe me, like 1 week later, when I went back, I looked back and I had no idea that all this is what I would get and how I can apply it. From going to the Niels Bohr Institute, seeing through an ice cone on how much pollution is affecting, or going to the farm with the lady who worked with Relay and seeing how you can have a farm which has chicken and pigs living together, being fed 80% on compost, and these small projects and lessons. How much have you seen this getting translated into? Because I think it's very difficult to convince people that just a week of perspective, not even directly teaching something, not directly teaching lessons, just showing these examples and case studies, I believe can have an impact, because I had the personal experience. But how much of it have you seen converting into a real impact?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions in there. I think, just for context, I guess if people don't know what MAD Academy was, so MAD was this nonprofit. It was founded by Renee, and over the past few years, they've developed what are essentially like 5-day kind of crash courses on fundamental knowledge areas that maybe you might not learn in culinary school, or won't get the foundational knowledge of throughout your career. And they focus on essentially business skills. So yeah, everything from finances and costing to, thinking about your business, staffing structures, that sort of thing. And then sort of management skills, which of course there's a lot of really valid critic of the industry. But again, I would point to a lack of resources. So you understand that equation, that people don't really have what they need to be good managers. And it's very hard to teach people things that you don't know. So I think a lot of senior people also really lack the knowledge and the skills to be able to pass on to new managers. And then also, of course, like we were really excited that, there's a really powerful potential in hospitality to work in more environmentally responsible ways. But people need to understand, like some of the examples you were pointing out, what are the impacts you can have with your food choices, or even like what energy supply you use in your business, which is a really big thing. So that's what MAD did. It brought 30 people at a time to Copenhagen for really intensive experiences. And I think the impact and the evaluations that we did on that were really positive. Like, we really changed people's mindsets. I think you mentioned that earlier. And I think we gave them community, which was something that wasn't the most expected positive outcome. But like you mentioned, and like maybe I admitted as well, like a lot of people are really alone, and there's nothing more demotivating or that makes change harder than not believing in it yourself and not feeling like other people want to sort of co-create that change. And I know that whilst there are a lot of people who come back from the program and are able and positioned to sort of make those changes, there's also a lot of people that come back and find it really difficult because their peers or their colleagues or their boss doesn't maybe believe in the same thing. And I think that that's one of the challenges of this model and of change, is like, not everyone gets that experience. And I think my sort of thoughts on that are that, like, the things you mentioned, Johanna Schimming, who's a great farmer here, the Niels Bohr Institute, who are like a scientific institute that work around climate and sort of planetary science. These are sort of resources that are available everywhere. I think what we also need to do is change the minds and the sort of value structure of chefs. And maybe when I say chefs, I also mean bartenders and coffee professionals and anyone who works in service or hospitality. It's like the information that we used to value was so focused on craft and on refinement, and that was validated by these outside structures and our sort of idols of the time. But I think we need new sets of knowledge, and we need to value those things and sort of have a more holistic view of what it is to be a hospitality professional. And I guess my cliff note would be that if we would put, 10% of the time and the money and the resources that we do into sort of learning our own way now. And by that, I mean spending money on eating in new places to try their food, or visiting winemakers, or buying books, or watching YouTube about how to cook. If we change 10% of that from technique and craft into some of the more fundamental things, if we can get chefs interested in, like, carbon footprints, or we can get coffee people who are young baristas to be fascinated about how the supply chain works. And if everybody gave a little bit more thought to learning about financial numbers and learning how to read a P&L statement, or to really accurately cost a dish, if that became a part of chefs or bartenders or baristas' sort of passion, I think the industry would, it's not a silver bullet, but I really believe the gains would be pretty shocking and pretty massive.
And now that you mentioned this, Jack, I mean, I had this question for you as well, and I think this is the right moment. What would you say are right now? Because I mean, it's such a fast changing scenario. I think COVID has also accelerated a lot of these changes and problems, which used to be problems. We're finally seeing solutions for them. But what would you say are the, I don't know, the few big topics right now in hospitality which people are looking answers for, and maybe education could be a method to get answers for these. So what would, like, the first few things that come to your mind when you think of hospitality?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I guess I would first acknowledge that. I mean, like hospitality is hugely diverse, and we touched on this at the
Mm-hmm.
start. Like, what a business in Mumbai, Calcutta,
Mm-hmm.
Singapore, Sydney, Melbourne, Copenhagen, Austria, what all these people need is kind of different. I guess if I point to like fundamental things, I genuinely think people need belief and sort of faith. Maybe that's like a sort of a surprising thing. They need some confidence and some sort of feeling of support. And I think somewhat sadly, or like in a conflicting way, like that's not going to come from the outside first.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of no one else's responsibility to like value hospitality. And I think, maybe it's a hard opinion, but like we need to do a better job of supporting one another and motivating and sort of valuing other hospitality businesses and each other's work. And that will hopefully draw value from the public and draw a different narrative than, these TV shows and the sort of accurate but sort of cherry-picked negative stories that exist. If we promote more of the positive stories and we sort of celebrate and share more good things about working in the industry, I think that that is a really important thing that can also carry on to changing maybe how people value coming into this industry or wanting to work in it as well. I think in terms of fundamental skills, like people really are searching for ways to reckon with the financial difficulties of our times. And I think like it's a really tough thing to run a hospitality business today, but it's also a tough thing to run generally businesses today. And I think that comes down to just a bit of financial literacy and learning a bit more about this and giving craftspeople better understanding of how their decisions impact, the bottom line of a business, whether that's around wastage or sourcing or more complex things like menu engineering and looking at marketing and promotion. I think there's a lot of want for resources around that. I think, also in excited ways, people are really looking to how do they provide a better working environment? How do they tackle some of these emerging wants from younger generations, but I think also things that established people are starting to speak up for and ask about, which is work-life balance, benefits, living wage. And I mean, these are really messy and really complex things because we're trying to change existing business models. And I think you can look at it in a way that we can't have a new type of business if we remain with the sort of margins of the past, right? The structures that we built hospitality businesses on, the way that we looked at staffing or training, all of that needs to evolve if we want the culture and the sort of types of places that we work to evolve as well. And that's very difficult. So I think people are out there looking for great examples for that, and places they can go and learn. I mean, we can talk about those, or I can give you some of the people that I find most interesting and
Mm-hmm.
exciting. But I think, yeah, those are sort of the two major things. Like, how do we sort of survive financially? And I think survival is one thing, but we should be really looking, how do we thrive and how do we turn this around so that we're in a really great place, not just sort of scraping by. And then, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
how do we make this a great industry to work in, physically, mentally, psychologically, um, and I think again, it's not all bad. There's a lot of progress being made. I think anyone who worked 20 years ago can readily admit that there's like a huge amount of change, but maybe that's not equally applied for everyone yet. And we need to get there.
How do you see, Jack, the role of regulations in this? Because I'm very interested in the part that you said about how do we make this place more appealing to people to get into it,
Mm.
to bring new ideas, and them feeling comfortable that it's not bringing a new idea is not necessarily complaining, but just you see a possibility which maybe the existing structure doesn't. And then comes regulation, which then enforces some of these practices, say working a limited number of hours or paying a certain amount of money. And then you have other regulations also coming in recently about sustainability, the whole food waste law that's coming in, where now the chef has to account for every food waste. At the same time, the chef can't make his or her staff work more than a certain amount of hours. How, like, are you seeing regulation being positive, or it has to be phased, or how is that working for restaurants?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I am necessarily the right person to answer. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not in a restaurant and I don't work in one, and I don't fully understand all the effects of regulations on restaurants. But I know it was a very common thing that people mentioned, that people find a lot of barriers or they feel a lot of sort of enforcement from these. And I think, we need to take them on with a sort of a positive take if we can, that these are trying to steer things in a direction that are, you know, ideally better for the collective or better for society or better for, the planet, but, that they're not always sympathetic or really necessarily very well researched into their actual effects on a business. Or, you know, the nature of regulation is often very one size fits all, and that, you know, whether you're a smaller business or a larger business, it might take up a lot more resources than you have, which, you know, in the end causes irreparable harm to your business. I think many people will talk about, you know, health inspections and wanting to ferment things and seeking flavor and craft. And that's, I think, maybe a negative mindset of hospitality that looks at these things as like getting in the way of doing fun things or getting in the way of being creative. And I think we know we need to sort of not demonize them or make them out to be the bad guy. But yeah, on the other hand, I'm not sure that they're like all that effective or that they're enforced well or equally. And, you know, these are a really contextual thing. These are really dependent down to like the city that you work in. And, you know, hospitality is in every city in the world. So they're going to be really diverse in their effects on people. I think being proactive and understanding that you, in owning or operating a business or choosing to work with one, you have legal responsibilities, and some of these things are put in place for the safety of others, but also, you know, that you've made a choice to participate in this construct of a business. And it is your responsibility to understand what governs you. And I think we tend to sort of lock the cupboard of the funny ferments when the people come looking. And I don't think that's the right way to address it. I think understanding what you are and aren't legally able to do is really important, even if it means that you feel it's limiting your creativity. And if that's the case, I think here, maybe a funny example, but these sort of ants, like forest ants, that are really tasty, have been used by restaurants for a long time. And they were like very popular, and they became a sort of very cool, written about ingredient. And they're delicious. I've eaten some ants, and let's not get into the morals and ethics of ants and things. But, you know, the government passed this sort of sweeping law about like wild foods and edibles, and these ants were banned. And I think what was nice was, you know, the sort of culinary community came together to sort of form a communal voice to speak to the government about the importance of these and to try to meet them in the middle to understand the regulations. Why were these things being challenged? Why were these sort of really interesting, creative, available product being taken out of the hands of craftspeople who were really thoughtful about how they used it? And, you know, seeing the other side of that argument and also showing the sort of culinary side of that argument, I think was a really fruitful experience. And, you know, being professional about that in your approach, whilst it might take a lot of time and maybe you don't have the resources, I think is the way to do it. It's the higher road, I suppose. And that's my advice from the outside, which again is easy to say and hard to do in practice.
No, definitely. But if examples like these, which help people to some extent, as you said, you have to listen to regulations and follow them to your possibilities. And the other is challenging the regulations when you figure out that these regulations just exist because nobody has thought otherwise. I remember this one day when we went through Mad Academy, again, another example from there with Johanna. And because I think, if I don't remember wrong, she came from a banking sector because she got like a first generation farmer, and she mentioned that Relay wanted to donate like fruit juice pulp or breads to her, but they just could not because it was stored in the same fridge as butter, which is dairy, and then somehow it makes it unfit for consumption of livestock. And it's
Yeah, I
people
think
like her who.
it's a great example. You know, I think we need to be a bit patient with it, like, especially around sustainability. Like, not very many people know a lot about how it should be done. Like, this is a sort of, you know, for better or worse, it's really like an emerging way of thinking. And I always think about it as like, you know, I'm 36. When I was raised, making decisions was sort of, you know, maybe you would think about the monetary impact and the impact on people. But now we're trying to include this other step in our decision making, which is, you know, the planet. And not everybody understands carbon emissions or the biodiversity impacts. Even the experts don't. And that's what I think, like, a lot of legislation is trying to act fast and trying to make change quickly. And it is done hastily. I think that's where we need to have professionals in dialogue and seeing the channels available. And, you know, activism has its place as well. But I think, like, trying to be positive and help and support these people make better legislation is the way to go.
And being very wishful, Jack, because a lot of, I mean, as you say, a lot of it doesn't make sense and a lot of it is not very obvious. Like I remember this a challenge we had with Magnus where we had to choose between a local lamb or a lamb imported from New Zealand. And that was the biggest surprise, that the one from New Zealand is more sustainable than the one in Copenhagen. So things which are not so obvious about sustainability, being very wishful, as I said, how would you see a future where, okay, there is education which is in culinary and hospitality. But how about the education that we all go through, or most of us, to be fortunate, through a school education, the primary education that we receive? How would you see a world where things like, not say not carbon footprint, but just understanding how your food arrives to your plate, or how composting is done, or how waste is managed by cities? How much of that do you think in private education or school education would make these battles easier, or these regulations more easier to understand?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, commenting on the sort of the education systems of countries and how education is structured, like I don't know if I'm qualified for that again, but yeah, I mean, I think like, we talked a bit earlier about like the role of food having changed, and I think people still, that's the case, but food for a lot of people is just a commodity. It's not a passion. It's fuel, or it's like an annoyance that they have to feed themselves, like we need to, in that sense, I think, sort of try to re-envision what food is and its role in culture and society and religion and history and many of these other things. But you kind of, it's really hard if you relate something to like five other things, then it becomes so complex to make decisions around. I'm all for. I totally like what this question is sort of trying to drive. That like, yes, kids should learn way more about food and agricultural production and the sort of importance both nutritionally in terms of environment, cultural, but also like the joy and the fun that comes from cooking and food. You don't want to judge those people that see it as fuel or something. But I mean, you eat 3 times a day. It's an act that you do probably more than many other things in your life. Like not having a bit of interest in it or not trying to make the most of each of those opportunities, or at least raise the baseline of them. I just think that's a bit of a bummer. Why not be interested in food? How do you learn about all those things and where? I think that's a great question. Should it become a part of education? Should there be more value put on it? Yeah. And I think that's also where, professionalizing hospitality and having the people who are supposed to be passionate and knowledgeable about these products and these things, having them understand that first would be a great step. And I'm not saying they don't. I don't want to, again, it's a broad brush. It's millions of people with very different contexts and different available resources. But I think, again, if we can sort of look at what chefs are or what that is to work a career in hospitality and start to insert some different sort of values around the knowledge there, then that can go a long way to showcasing to the public that this is interesting to know and that food and its complexities are important for everybody to learn about.
Coming back to you, Jack, where are you headed next? Because, or like, what kind of opportunities are you looking at? Because I think the people listening to this, it happens to be a podcast about food, but more focused on careers and what possibilities of careers there are out there. So as somebody who has been in hospitality, been behind bars, got into Mad Academy as running educational programs for hospitality professionals, what jobs do you see for yourself, or like, where do you see for your career opportunity?
Yeah, it's a very timely question. As I said, I've been on a bit of a career break after Mad, and I think like this is a really interesting time to be looking at jobs. I don't know if I'm going to answer your question. I'll start with that because I don't know if I have an answer, and I don't know if me sort of publicizing what job I'm looking for is what the listeners need. But I think like philosophically and sort of like the philosophies of jobs and work and how those sort of constructs interact with our life is really changing. And I see that and I feel that as an individual. And, like it's great you asked about sort of career advice or advice for younger people earlier. Like, I think it's really hard to know where to head and what kind of skills or businesses you should be working for in hospitality these days. But I think it's really difficult to do that in the world in general. Like the idea of business and what we should be doing with our time when we're at a workplace is like really changing. And I think for the better, people maybe weren't as thoughtful, or business as a construct was really about, growth or financial means or, yeah, I think the sort of bottom line in a way was really anchored in different stuff. And now people want to work for places that are like making the world better, or that are trying to provide fantastic working environments, or that are trying to, like you pointed out, if you're a chef, going cooking to school, Dan Giusti is a fantastic example of that. And I think he has some really great provocations to why do we value the work of a fine dining chef who feeds 30 people for $300 versus, a catering cook who feeds 300 people for $1? And what's a better use of skills? And I think this is a good thing. But right now, like we only really sort of have the old examples and old ways of doing things. And I feel this, it's like, I can look at what I would have done with my career a few years ago had I followed that path. But now I think there are a lot more interesting examples out there. But they're not proven. They're not as sort of evidenced. And there's not that many sort of idols or, multiple generations of people who've paved a way to be a Dan Giusti or a Portia Hart, who is this like really phenomenal hotelier in Cartagena, who, knew nothing about hospitality, but has started probably some of the most inspiring and sustainable businesses that exist. But I mean, she had no guidance. She didn't know what she was doing. And I think that's because she set out to do something new that she believed was right on a sort of set of modern principles or with modern knowledge. And so, yeah, what am I looking to do next is find a way to navigate that myself, I think. And then, yeah, hopefully find a place where I can provide some of the things that I've sort of opinionated here, that like I want to help some people grow, help some people value different knowledge and different interests and bring those into a business, whether it's hospitality. Yeah, and continue to sort of talk and try to make sense of this with people like yourself and others who are out there creating the resources that I think hospitality really lacks, and providing some sort of space or some guidance to people where they can come and find that. So yeah.
Such a cool answer, Jack. I mean, we can't wait to look forward to what comes out of this. And it's been a great chat. I thought I knew you. We've met before, but all that I've heard in the past 1 hour has, yeah, opened to all you had been involved with, and it's been really nice hearing to you. Most of the advices you've given, I think the ones I stick to is it's for carving your own way and not really looking for say a position that has to exist, or generations of examples that have to exist. If there is a calling and if there is a value within you that you see, is just how can you show that value to a potential employer, or carve out a business of yourself which lets you be true to that value. So yeah, I think I hope all those listening to this get as much value or more than what I got. And yeah, thanks once again for being a part of this.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Frekan. I mean, it's a great thing. As I said, I'm a big fan and a listener, and yeah, I look forward to hearing a couple more episodes of Fugitive Chef down the line. And yeah, let's see what happens.
Thanks so much, Jack. See you.